Okay, we're going to get started here. Thanks to everyone for joining and your interest in learning more about Convergence in general. As we look forward to our official launch next week at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, we're really thrilled about the number of participants that we have here and really looking forward to having an informative and hopefully interactive session with you all. And we'll go through the agenda in just a moment, but before we do so, I want to quickly introduce myself and some of the other voices you'll hear today. So my name is Darren Kingston. I work for the Global Development Incubator, and I'm currently acting as sort of an interim COO for Convergence. We also have Rashna Saxena, who's with Dahlberg Global Development Advisors and acting as a chief strategist for Convergence, leading the implementation of the investment network. And the last voice that you'll hear is Anshel Bhatia, who's Convergence's investment associate who supports our investment network users. We form about half of Convergence interim staff, all of whom sit within GDI or Dahlberg as the organizations that have been designing and implementing Convergence for almost a year now. There are a few others, including Serena Guarnaschelli and Dean Siegel, who I know some of you have been talking to and are on the call as well, who work on the investment network and design funding, respectively. So turning to the agenda, we understand that some of you are already familiar with Convergence, but since many are hearing about it for the first time on this call, what we'd like to cover in about the first half of the hour is an overview on Convergence overall, followed by a demo of our still work in progress website, and then next steps for interested organizations. So that'll take about the first half of the call, and then we'll have around 30 minutes at the end for discussion and any questions you may have after the presentation. And just quickly, a few notes before we begin. With reference to the demo, please bear in mind that the website that you'll see is still a testing version of the site. It's in the midst of some final refinements before we go live next week. So this site and the way that Rashna will navigate through that today will look slightly different than what you'll see next week. So just a caveat there. And lastly, we placed all lines on mute and ask you to send any questions through the chat box to our host as we move through the material, and we'll take all those down and be sure to address as many as possible during the second half of the session. All right, so to get started here, we thought we'd just begin with sort of, what is Convergence? So in a nutshell, Convergence is a platform that connects and supports private, public, and philanthropic investors for blended finance deals in emerging and frontier markets. And blended finance, for those of you who aren't familiar, is simply the strategic use of public and philanthropic funds to attract private capital toward investments that can deliver development impact in emerging and frontier markets. And this practice allows public and philanthropic investors to magnify the impact of their funding, private investors to access lower risk and potentially enhanced returns in these markets, and ultimately a greater influx of funding, potentially as high as 10x, according to some research, towards sustainable development goals. So next, to give you just a sense of kind of where Convergence, sort of its origin story, where did it come from and who's behind it. So Convergence was conceived under the World Economic Forum and OECD DAC's Redesigning Development Finance Initiative. It's now structured as an independent nonprofit headquartered in Toronto. Currently, sort of where we are in terms of our, organizational setup, we have a very active board of directors, multi-stakeholder advisory committee, as you can see here. Convergence, it receives funding from the Government of Canada and Citi. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this call, the Global Development Incubator has been leading the design and implementation of Convergence for about a year now, and will continue to support a transition to a permanent staff early this year, so first half of 2016. So next point, just quickly, how does it work? Convergence was designed to address critical barriers constraining the blended finance market through three main offerings: design, funding, market building resources, and the investment network. So design funding spurs innovation by reducing the costs and risks of designing and testing blended finance products. the facility provides grant funding and disseminates learning to the broader market. And you'll hear a bit more about this as Rachna takes us through the demo. Convergence's market-building resources, such as aggregated case studies, research, and other reports, and offline trainings will ease the investment process and help investors understand opportunities and structure deals. And lastly, the investment network enables investors to find and connect with each other to co-invest in emerging and frontier markets through investor and deal databases. The bulk of the demo that you'll see momentarily will focus on the investment network. And just to give you a flavor of some of our pioneer users to date, which we hope many of you will also become following this call, these include organizations like Black Rhino, Citi, Grassroots Business Fund, COICA, Gates Foundation, Global Affairs Canada. So I'm now going to hand over to Rachna, who will take us through a demo of the testing site to give you a better idea of how your organizations would interact with the Convergence platform.
Great. So all of you should now see my screen. If you're not able to see my screen, please write again to the host and through the chat function of WebEx, and they will be able to help you. And again, for those of you who are just dialed in and not onto the WebEx, we encourage you to actually log on to the website so that you will be able to follow along throughout this demo. So for those of you who are able to see my screen now, we're looking at the home page of Convergence. And for any individual that wants to access the design funding or the resources section of the website, they can simply register on Convergence with their name, their email address, and the organization that they're affiliated with. So first, we're going to sort of dive into the design funding section of the website. The page that you see here provides a basic overview of the design funding section of Convergence. So it talks about the types of activities that can be funded and the overall application process. When we go live next week on January 20th, there will be 2 funding windows that will be open for applications. The first is an open window where practitioners can apply for funding for any type of blended finance product that combines public, private, and philanthropic capital. And they can also apply for funding specifically for results-based financing products. More information about both of these windows will be on the Convergence site, such as the overall timeline for their applications and the specific criteria for the applications as well. And then if you do decide to go ahead and submit a concept note or proposal, you can submit those applications on the website as well. And so we'll say a little bit more about the upcoming grant funding windows at the end of our presentation as well, and can answer any questions that you may have at that point. We can now turn to the resources section of the website. Here you're going to see kind of a different range of resources that really help to kind of build awareness of exactly what blended finance is, and also increase knowledge in terms of how to use it effectively. So if we look at the knowledge library, you're going to see a range of tools here that really help you understand this space better. There are case studies on historical blended finance transactions, primers and toolkits that teach you how to use blended finance efficiently, and also policy and research reports that tell you more about this space. For all of the resources and the knowledge tools that are on the library, you can either search through them by entering any keywords in, or you can also filter by things like region, sector, and knowledge type. For all of the information that's on Convergence in the knowledge library, these are either proprietary Convergence and have been developed by us, or have been developed by third-party resources, and we've curated them for our site. Another resource that is particularly helpful, I think, for deal sponsors and deal providers is the service provider directory. All the institutions listed here provide support like technical assistance support, structuring support, project preparatory support that Convergence itself is not going to be able to provide. Essentially, Convergence was designed to really fill kind of a unique space in the blended finance ecosystem, and we didn't want to repeat what others in the space were doing. So we have worked with other initiatives to ensure that we are really kind of creating this broader ecosystem of blended finance support. So for example, Convergence will work with other initiatives to aggregate their deal pipeline, particularly if they have specific capabilities that Convergence does not, such as extensive local expertise or sector-specific expertise. The last part of the resources section that we're just going to quickly go through are the trainings and workshops. These are, again, really focused on improving understanding of exactly what blended finance is and enhancing collaboration between the public and the private investors. You can see on the site that Convergence has actually hosted and supported 2 workshops in the run-up to the launch, one was focused on agriculture, one was focused on health. And as we have more workshops that are going to be launched over the next couple of months, all the information about those will be included here as well. So again, all of the information about the design funding and the resources are available to anyone who signs up on the website with simply their email address and their name. To access the databases of deals and investors, however, your institution actually needs to be registered on the Convergence platform. And so for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to log in as the fictional Rachel Wynn. She is the CEO of Wynn Capital Partners, which is a PE firm based out of London that is investing in education and healthcare businesses in Africa and East Asia. And they're actively raising their second education fund. So her main goal on Convergence today is to really post a deal and look for investors. In this case, Rachel Wynn is already registered on the Convergence platform, but just at a high level, in order to qualify for access to these databases, your institution needs to have been in business for 2 years, be accredited as an investor or investment advisor in your local jurisdiction, and have a reference from another institution on the platform. We'll go over a little bit more of the details of these criteria and the registration process later on in this presentation. So once I'm logged into the platform, I can go to the account info section of the website and change personal information about myself. And as sort of the key contact for my organization, I can go in, review information about my institution as it's displayed on the Convergence site, and update it at any given time, depending on how my organization evolves. So at any given time, I can change how my organization is described or how I describe our overall investment process. So let's say I'm looking to fundraise for a deal. I would then go to the section of the website that would allow me to submit my deal for fundraising. And just to provide a little bit more detail about the types of deals that will be on Convergence, any fund, project, or business that's focused on emerging or frontier markets with a minimum deal size of $5 million and an anchor investor that is committed in some way to the transaction is eligible for posting on Convergence. And again, we're happy to go through that as well in more detail during the Q&A section. So looking again specifically at Rachel Wynn's transaction, here is where I would enter in specific information about the transaction. So for instance, this is my second education fund that I'm raising. I would enter in kind of a brief snapshot of my deal that I want to be emailed out to investors and included on the deal database. I'd include a more detailed overview of the transaction that people could review once they clicked on my transaction. I would enter in information about the intended development impact of my transaction. And then I would enter in sort of demographic details about the transaction. So I'd indicate that this is a fund, I'm seeking equity and grants, I'm specifically focused on the education sector with this fund, it's a sub-Saharan African fund, specifically West Africa, so I can sort of even indicate which countries I'm specifically interested in, and then I can indicate my total deal size and the amount of financing that's sought. If we go to the next page here, this is where I would also enter information about who my existing co-investors are, anchor investors, and LPs are. So as we mentioned earlier, each deal on the platform must have some sort of initial commitment from an anchor investor. This does not need to be an investment that's already been made, but at least some indication of some level of commitment. So for instance, it could be a verbal commitment to invest, it could be an LOI, it could have gone through investment committee, so it could be any sort of initial commitment to invest. And the rationale for having this requirement for posting a deal is that we want to make sure that the deals that are posted on Convergence are credible and that someone has reviewed them in some level of detail and done some level of due diligence to ensure that these are worthwhile deals that should be posted on Convergence. So the anchor investor will actually be included in your deal profile to enhance the credibility of the deals that are shown on the platform. For those specific investors, particularly private sector investors, that don't want their name publicly associated with the transaction, you can choose to anonymize the description of them, and that is what's going to be displayed on the website. The last piece of information that you'll enter about your transaction is information such as your fund structure, any activities to date, expected returns, et cetera. And you'll also be able to upload any sort of standard pitch documents that you see. Once that you have sort of completed all of the necessary information, you'll get a chance to review this information about your transaction and then submit it to Convergence for review. Convergence will then make sure that your information has been filled out correctly, and they will also get in touch with your anchor investor to confirm that they are comfortable with inclusion on your deal profile, potentially in an anonymized way. Once all of this has been confirmed, then your deal is approved and published on the Convergence site. Once your deal is approved and published, there are 3 different ways in which you can match with investors. The first way that you can connect with investors is by getting automatically matched and automatically notified. So you can get emails that will notify you when there are investors that match your specific transaction. You can also log on to the Convergence site, go to your activity dashboard, and see investors that are recommended for you. And obviously, for now, this is sort of just dummy information. If I want to look at investors that perhaps aren't an exact match but may have some overlapping interests, I can go to the investor database. Here is where I can see all the different investors that have registered on Convergence. Again, I can sort of do a keyword search to look for specific types of investors, or I can, again, filter by different factors. So, for instance, let's say I'm interested in anybody who is involved in the education space, and then I want to look at who's involved in education, specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa. It narrows down the pool of investors that I see. I can then click on the investor profile, get more information about that specific investor and their investment preferences, and also choose to send them a message. The way that the messaging system works is that it is sent to a centralized mailbox, which all individuals from that institution have access to, and they can then choose to respond individually to that deal sponsor, and then all communication is taken offline. So that's the second way that you can match to an investor, is by searching through the investor database. The third way that you can match with an investor is through an online roadshow. So Convergence will have the functionality to have an online webinar, an online roadshow, in order to target either specific investors or all investors that are on Convergence. So those are the 3 ways that you can match to investors. And once you've actually matched to investors, you can choose to continue all further kind of communications offline, or you can choose to use the deal room and the collaboration tools on the Convergence site itself. If you choose to use the deal room on Convergence, you would simply create the deal room and then grant individual investors access to the deal room. So just to show you quickly sort of what the back end of the deal room would look like, these are the different investors that have requested access. For instance, Tim Carden from Carden Capital, I would approve or reject his access to the deal room, and depending on how he gets through the due diligence process, I would subsequently access or provide him access to different sections and different document groups, depending on where he is in the DD process. So now we'll quickly flip and show you kind of the front end of the deal room here. You'll see here that the deal room has sort of several different features. The first part of it is a checklist of the overall deal process. This is a checklist that's sort of completely customized by the deal sponsor to list the different activities throughout the process, and either the investor or the deal sponsor can sort of check off specific tasks as they are completed. And while this isn't sort of a standard deal room feature, the idea was that we want to create transparency in the overall transaction process, because oftentimes public and private sector investors don't always understand the process on the other side. So by having a very kind of transparent checklist, which both sides can see and check off, we're trying to enhance overall collaboration through the platform. The second part, investors can actually access different documents depending on the access levels that are given to them by the deal sponsor, and depending on the security level set on specific documents, they can either view the online, or they can download them and print them. Then the third piece of the deal room is the public forum. And this is where investors can ask questions of the deal sponsor publicly. And in many ways, this is essentially publicly sharing the due diligence process with other investors. And again, this is only for those that want to use it. It's more likely to happen with sort of public transactions. But again, it's just an additional feature here. So overall, again, the deal room is not a required part of the Convergence site. It is just an optional feature for those that find it helpful. The basic overview of Convergence. As Darren mentioned, Convergence will be launching in Davos on January 20th. At that time, the first 2 windows for the design funding grants will be open for applications. We're going to have over 70 market building resources that will be available at that point. And for our investor database, we will have a group of pioneer users that will be on that. And for our deal database, we'll have over 150 historical transactions on that database. Later this year, we'll also have live deals added to the deal database pending some regulatory approvals and relevant markets. So now I'm going to turn it over to Anshul, who is our investment associate, to close us out on some next steps, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you.
Thanks, Rachna. So now that you all have a comprehensive overview of Convergence and its different offerings, I'll go over some concrete ways on how you can get involved. We're currently bringing in investors to join the investment network so that they can broaden their own network, learn from detailed data on past deals, and be the first to access live deals in Convergence in the next few months. So let's quickly review the criteria for institutions eligible to join the investment network. For private investors and intermediaries, they must meet the following requirements. First one being like a legally registered institution in the country of domicile, be registered or licensed by the securities regulator in their country of domicile, have been in operation for a minimum of 2 years. If not, you must provide your management bios, and have a reference from a registered investment network users, except for pioneer users, in which case Convergence acts as the reference. Institutions that do not meet this criteria may occasionally be approved on an exceptional basis by the Convergence's leadership. So please send in your registration forms regardless for us to review. Large foundations and public institutions such as aid agencies and DFIs that are not required to receive accreditation by their local regulators will also be eligible to join the platform. So for those of you who do meet the criteria and are interested in becoming a pioneer user before Davos launch, we would need you to complete and send back this one-page form you see here on the slide by January 15th. This form simply asks for very high-level public information such as your overview of your organization, legal address, etc., and key contact and email address to set up their user profile. As Rachna mentioned, for those of you who will be looking to invest in live deals once they're added to the deal database, we may ask for additional documentation pending some legal requirements. Our first 100 pioneer users will benefit from waived subscription fees for 2016, increased marketing value of your institution through our media sectors. So once we have received your completed registration forms, our team will set up your user profile and we'll send you your login information before our January 20th launch date and all other related information. Other kinds of organizations, there are 2 other ways to get involved in the short term. The first one is the grant funding window. Anyone who signs up for the Convergence website can access and apply for funding under the design funding component. As Rachna mentioned, again, on January 20th, 2 funding opportunities will be available. The first one being results-based financing window. Practitioners can apply for funding to design RBF products, also called performance-based incentives. And the second one is the open window, in which practitioners can also apply for funding to design any blended finance product that addresses a specific development challenge and meets $50,000 to $200,000 US for feasible studies, or $200,000 to $750,000 US for designing a proof of concept for the product. And lastly, if you have experience in the blended finance and or emerging and frontier market spheres that are interested in being included in the service provider directory, as Rachna mentioned in the demo, please contact us after the session and we can also get you the registration form for that. So now we'd like to just open up for questions. So I'll turn it back to Darren and Rachna to moderate the Q&A session.
Great, thanks, Anshul. So we've got a number of questions in that we're going to try to cover as many as possible, and I'll just kind of bundle some of them as well. So just a reminder that, if you do have a question, please send that in the chat to the host, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I think just since to kind of clarify a point related to the sort of deal posting, deal process, there was a question around sort of what kind of due diligence will Convergence do and sort of general quality assurance overall. So I'm going to ask Rachna to speak to that point briefly.
Yeah, so the question was specifically about sort of the due diligence that Convergence will do on the transaction. And so Convergence is not going to be registered as a broker-dealer, and thus we ourselves will not be doing the due diligence on transactions. The way that we're going to assure the quality of the transactions on the platform is by having that anchor investor requirement. And so the anchor investor needs to have committed in some way to that transaction, and who that anchor investor is and what type of commitment has been made is going to be listed on the deal profile itself. And so if the anchor investor is not comfortable with a full public disclosure of their name could be anonymized. And then it is up to the investor to sort of feel if the deal is credible enough and sort of the quality that they're interested in moving forward in the due diligence process and going from there. So that's how we're assuring the quality of the specific deals. And then obviously, as Anshul said, we are sort of assuring the quality of the institutions overall on Convergence that would be posting the transactions by requiring that they are accredited and they do have a referral from others on the platform.
Great, thanks, Rachna. There were also a couple of questions related to sort of general regulatory issues and sort of eligibility, and Anshul walked through the eligibility requirements once more, so hopefully that's clear at this point. But in general, we are working with lawyers and regulators in a range of jurisdictions where we would like to be able to bring investors onto the profile who intend to actually, eventually deploy capital into some of the deals that they find on the deal database. And so we're having to sort of look to country-specific regulators to give guidance on what are the requirements in those cases. So that may vary between, say, the Canada versus the U.S. versus the UK versus Switzerland in terms of exactly what categories of investors are eligible and exactly what kind of basically licensing that Convergence would need to do so. So that's something that we'll continue to work on and provide clarity to investors in those specific jurisdictions, as soon as we have that more finally. So in terms of, there was also a question related to sort of, obviously we talked about this being a blended finance initiative, and Rachna went through sort of the sectors and the geographies that are eligible, but we had a question about just what are the criteria in terms of actual blended finance versus more sort of straightforward investing, and Rachna, I'll turn to you to answer that one.
Yeah, so Convergence is very much designed to be a platform that focuses on blended finance. So the idea is that the transaction should be mixing public or private or philanthropic capital together in some way in order to complete the investment. And the rationale that we sort of focused exclusively on blended finance is that's where we saw a gap in the market. And I know some of the other questions that I'm seeing appearing on the screen is sort of talking about how is Convergence different from other financing platforms. And essentially is when we started to conceive the idea of Convergence almost a year ago at this point, we did look at the other platforms that were out in this space. I think we benchmarked around about 60 other different platforms, ranging from sort of pure sort of social stock exchange type platforms to purely commercial platforms and secondary type platforms. And we really felt that, despite the range of platforms out there, there was a unique niche in sort of the blended finance space, filling the gap between impact investing and purely commercial platforms. And I think other things to sort of highlight in terms of why Convergence is a bit unique is that it is sector and region agnostic, and it kind of provides a range of different services and offerings to support blended finance deals that are at different stages of maturity. And we really seek to kind of play a complementary role to existing platforms and sort of address challenges that aren't sort of fully addressed by others, such as sort of high design costs we're trying to address through the design funding facility, the lack of knowledge and data we're trying to obviously address through our resources, and kind of the high search cost to find investors or transactions is what we're trying to address through the databases of deals and investors. So it really is trying to do a complementary role to others, but very specifically focused on the blended finance space.
Great, and then there was just another request for clarification around minimum deal sizes and exactly how that works. So, Rashna, if you could speak to that as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so regarding the minimum deal size, that needs to be the total size of the transaction. So a total transaction size needs to be $5 million US. If you already have an anchor investor, for instance, you have a total size transaction of $5 million, you already have an anchor investor for $1 million, so you're only seeking $4 million on the platform, that's fine. But we just sort of want to make sure that it is total transaction sizes that are of that kind of minimum ticket size, because we want to be clear that we're not sort of focusing on very small micro enterprises or even sort of the smaller end of the SME space, but really kind of larger ticket sizes.
Great, thanks. So there have been a couple questions related to sort of revenue models, fees overall. So to try to address a couple points all at once, basically for 2016, for the first 100 investment network users that are on the platform, fees will be waived for 2016. Beginning in 2017, we're expecting a tiered fee structure tied to something like assets under management to apply to investment network users. And I'll just, as a reminder, say that the access to the market building resources and the design funding is, completely free to anyone. So in terms of fees, we're really just talking about the investment network here. There may also be the introduction of sort of a flat rate fee to post a deal, but part of what, we expect Convergence to do in year one is sort of gauge willingness to pay across sort of investor categories and across these various tier groups. So a lot of this will be worked out in its first sort of official startup year. So hopefully that gives some clarification there. There was also a question about sort of how we will determine whether deals have actually been completed, and that's an important clarification because Convergence is not an actual exchange. There will be no transactions completed through Convergence. There'll be no exchange of securities or funding through Convergence. The expectation is that this is sort of the dating site, if you will, between various investors and deals and their sort of different capabilities, as Rashna mentioned, such as messaging functions in deal rooms that help people get in touch and begin to collaborate, but that the conversation and the work to actually close the deal will be done offline. And so recognizing then that is a bit of a then data collection requirement for Convergence, we'll be setting up a system where essentially we'll be asking any deal sponsor to let us know when a deal needs to be closed and have its status transition from something that is actively fundraising to something that is closed and therefore ideally goes into our database of historical transactions as a comp. And that will be accompanied with, a brief survey to get a bit more data on sort of what the final commitments were and other key points. So changing gears a bit, sort of a couple higher level questions we want to be sure to touch on. There's a question related to, given the role of the Government of Canada and their recent transition in government, the funding that's been committed to Convergence, which is 20 million Canadian, is fully committed and that's codified and all of that came in before the transition in government, and so that funding is 100% secure, and Canada continues to be a supporter of blended finance. So even in terms of more soft support, we don't expect any major changes there. They continue to be engaged in Convergence, both as a user on the advisory committee and in a number of ways. And there's also a question about Well, sorry, Rachna, you already addressed the point about sort of working with other platforms and that sort of thing. We will have a service provider directory where we will, like, specifically sort of give credit, if you will, to various pipeline providers and other sort of tech platforms or sort of offline providers that are sort of filling gaps where Convergence is unable. So that's just another point on ways in which we will sort of collaborate with others in the space. Sorry, let me just take a minute here to get through a couple other questions. So there was a question related to sort of how do social enterprises that are not already doing anything in blended finance, may not be in an explicit deal process, how might they engage with Convergence? And I think it's worth a clarification on sort of exactly how that kind of entity might engage. So Rachna, I'll ask you to take that.
They would need to be posted by an investor or investment advisor and would need to have sort of an anchor investor in that transaction. So I know that this is going to be crowding out and in some ways, meaning that some types of social enterprises will not be able to post, knowing that there are other platforms that are out there that are specifically focused on the social enterprise impact investing space. And so for Convergence itself, it is sort of looking at larger types of transactions and transactions that are sort of following a more sort of traditional deal structure.
Yeah, and the other point to make there is that for any entity that has sort of a concept that they'd like to do some design and research and design and testing around in terms of actual blended finance instruments, that organization can apply for design funding and sort of use that as a way to make more progress towards eventually potentially having some sort of transaction that would be eligible for listing on the deal database. So, sorry, we have a number of questions coming in, so just give us a second here to kind of figure out what we've not yet spoken to. So there was just more of a kind of process question about whether we will be sharing this presentation as any kind of link that people can share with others in their organization to help get others up to speed. And I believe that we have the technology to do so, and assuming that is the case, we'll be following up this call with a reminder on sort of the registration process, some key deadlines, and we can include this information in that email as well. Sorry, I'm just giving a second to see if anything else that we haven't yet touched on is coming in. But I think that essentially, hopefully this has covered a lot of the ground, a lot of the key questions that many of you had. Let's see, I think we have a couple more here that we'll answer online, but otherwise, I think everyone who's on this call is aware of how to get in touch with us. So if there's anything that we didn't answer that remains critical, you can reach out and we'll try to get those. Just wrapping up here, there's a question around the due diligence process and whether this includes assessments, equator principles, and/or any IFC social and environmental sustainability standards. And Rachna, I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, so again, Convergence itself is not going to be doing any due diligence of the transactions. What we do require for deals that are being posted and submitted on Convergence is that you indicate the intended development impact, which sort of includes the ESG requirements or implications of your deal as well. And then we also have sort of a negative screen to confirm that the specific transaction is not involved in any sort of sectors, and this has been taken from sort of the B Corp negative screen. So the idea is that each individual transaction will indicate specific information about their intended development impact and ESG impacts, and that will be then evaluated by the investor. But Convergence itself is not actually doing sort of the evaluation of these impacts.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you. I hope that this was as informative as everyone was expecting, and as we said, we'll be following up with just some reminders on key information related to the investment network form that was distributed, around deadlines, and I'll just say it here to reiterate the point. We're hoping to get all of these forms back by the 15th for those of you who'd like to be included in time for our launch at Davos next week. That, you know, we'll be sort of listing everyone who's involved in our press release. This demo as much as possible in this immediate follow-up. And then you'll receive another newsletter about our launch on the 20th. There are a few final details that are falling into place, so we'll just be sure everyone's aware. And if you're interested in the design funding, please keep an eye out for that as well, because there'll be information just kind of confirming some more details there. And lastly, we had mentioned the service provider directory. If you are interested in being listed in there, you can be in touch and we can provide more information offline too. And any other questions, please send them our way and we'll get back to everyone as quickly as possible. Thank you for your time.